Welcome back to Fossil versus Future, an intergenerational conversation about climate change. I'm Daisy.
And I'm James.
And today we are thrilled to be joined by Clover Hogan to explore a big intergenerational what about activism. Clover Hogan is a climate activist and the founder of Force of Nature, the youth nonprofit mobilizing mindsets for climate action. She has worked alongside the world's leading authorities on sustainability, consulted within the boardrooms of Fortune 50 companies, and counselled heads of state. Her TED Talk, What to Do When Climate Change Feels Unstoppable, has been viewed 2 million times. I was lucky enough to see you speak, Clover, alongside other inspiring young changemakers at the Conduit last month. And it was honestly one of the most thought-provoking, motivating, and most human panel sessions I've seen. And we can put the link to that in the show notes. When I Googled the definition of activism, it said, the policy or action of using vigorous campaigning to bring about political or social change. When I dug a little deeper, I found a Greenpeace article where their volunteers were asked to define activism. Activism is spreading the word. Activism is doing what you can. Activism is taking a risk. Activism is speaking truth to power. Activism is building a community. Activism is finding what you can do. Clover, thank you so much for joining us today. And maybe that's a good place to start. What does activism mean to you?
Great question. And thank you so much for having me. Really excited about this conversation. I think my definition of activism has evolved so many times over the years. For me, my kind of catalyst was discovering documentaries when I was 11. And I announced off the back of that to my parents over dinner that I wanted to become an activist. And I honestly had no idea what that meant. But all I knew is that, you know, I felt a lot of grief and frustration and anger at the state of the world. And the more I learned, the more that sense of kind of injustice deepened. And with it, I felt a deep inspiration for the people who I'd seen kind of working on the front lines of these issues. You know, whether it was watching The Cove and seeing these environmental activists try to defend the lives of dolphins that were being culled, or Al Gore, you know, in An Inconvenient Truth. There was this whole spectrum of people from different corners of the world responding to the issues, both in their own corners, in their own communities, but also on a global scale. And I just knew that I wanted to be one of those people. And so to begin with, that really looked like kind of storytelling. I moved to Indonesia when I was 13, and that put me up close with a lot of these issues. You know, every year the sky would turn yellow and smoggy from the burning of Borneo to produce palm oil. And I started asking more and more questions, right? I was like, okay, well, why do these problems exist? Who's driving them? I started to learn about these big corporations, Procter & Gamble, Unilever, Nestle, the ones who were, you know, driving the kind of global demand for these products. And it was easy to feel kind of powerless in the face of all of that. But I think for me, I was like, how do we actually hold these companies to account? So inspired by the documentaries I'd seen, I started filmmaking from an early age. And I would make these mockumentaries about these companies. So kind of like spoof ads where, you know, the secret ingredient in Dove's Ultra Shine shampoo range is orangutan tears, you know, things like that. And then when I was 16, I was at COP21 as a student activist. And that was the first time I was actually engaging with those leaders, you know, on that global stage, policymakers, business leaders. And what really struck me was how much I shared with a lot of those people on a really human level. You know, I'd speak to these leaders who had multi-billion-dollar budgets, were employing, you know, tens of thousands of people. And they would say, well, what do you expect us to do, right? Like, we're just as shackled to business as usual in the kind of system. And so I started to realize that, you know, perhaps the threat even greater than climate change was this very pervasive feeling of powerlessness in response to it, you know, which wasn't just felt by citizens and young people like myself, but people in positions of power. And so then my activism really evolved, and it was, okay, well, how do we change mindsets within boardrooms? How do we change the mindsets of people in power? My first job in the UK was with John Elkington, who many of us consider the godfather of sustainability.
Yeah.
Both of us have got a connection.
Both work with John.
Both work with John.
And John's amazing, as you both know, and he really just took me under his wing. And, I honestly didn't have anything very eloquent or smart to say, but he'd bring me into these rooms with people, in these positions of power. And he facilitated this kind of intergenerational dialogue. And, through those conversations, I saw the humanity of those people in those rooms. But I, again, started to really question, well, are businesses, out of the good of their hearts, going to choose to do the right and responsible thing? Because even if you have myriad people who are very, values aligned and, ethically driven, whatever, the system does penalize like good behavior, basically. And oftentimes there isn't a business case for sustainability. And so then the next iteration of my activism was mobilizing young people to kind of hold people in power to account and getting much more involved in the kind of advocacy space of how do we regulate and hold these companies to account when they're not going to do it themselves. So that was a super long-winded answer to your question, but it hopefully illustrates this idea that like activism doesn't look any which way and there's not one correct kind of theory of change or approach. Like we need all of the things simultaneously.
Got it. Lots of nice references there to past conversations and people who we know and love and have worked with, and COP21 too. And we'll go back to that maybe later. So one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about is, you've already taken us there, but let's just develop it a bit more, is power. When you have some relatively clear strategic objective and maybe some sense of the tactics to get there, you should be asking yourself all the time, who's got the power I need to get there if I haven't got it myself? One of the things we've been concerned to deal with in these conversations, particularly for those who feel powerless, is to encourage and maybe even enable, but to not have anger lead to despair, to not have young people in particular feel like it's awful, but there's nothing I can do about it. So can we just talk a little bit more about finding the connections or accepting that you might have to work with somebody else you might not even agree with on other topics, who has the power to get you to where you want to go?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think something that was really fortunate about the start of my own journey was this kind of naive optimism. And this is perhaps best illustrated by a friend of mine, Malati Wyson, who's on the panel that you came to.
I'm reading her book at the moment.
Amazing.
It's fantastic.
So Malati and I both went to the Green School, and the Green School is unique not just because of its, bamboo classrooms and compost toilets and the fact that, we have a solar farm, but because it invites young people to go out and solve the problems they're passionate about. So for Malati and her sister, that problem was plastic pollution, which has absolutely taken over, our island of Bali. And so when they were 10 and 12 years old, they said, okay, well, we want to ban plastic. But they're like, okay, that's a very ambitious, audacious goal of an island of millions of people. So let's scale that back and say plastic bags. And they said, okay, we're going to create a petition and get 1 million people to sign this petition to ban plastic bags. And at 10 and 12, they had no concept of how huge that number was. But they had the kind of naive optimism to go out and do it. And so every day they would go and petition, tourists arriving in Bali. At one point, they went on a hunger strike to capture the attention of the governor of Bali. They would sit outside his office. They would do these big beach cleanups. And they never made it to that 1 million mark. But as a direct result of their activism and their campaigning, Bali signed into law a ban on plastic bags. So they're a kind of testament to what is possible when you don't give in to that feeling of powerlessness. And when you say change can happen, but you need to be really consistent, as you said and alluded to, you need to be willing to sit down and have the conversation with the person you might not like. Yeah. You need to learn how to lobby them. Those are all really fundamental skills. I think this moment that we're in is so challenging because we've never seen, I believe, such an extreme concentration of particularly economic power, right? Yeah. So today we have 26 of the wealthiest people in the world. They own as much as the poorest 3.8 billion. And we're seeing those social chasms deepen, more and more by the day. we're seeing this deep kind of exchange between corporations and the governments who are supposed to regulate them. Yes, it's, super obvious and blatant in America, but it also happens, here in the
Many
UK.
places,
Yeah, here in Europe. And so I look to history to find kind of inspiration for how change might happen. And from what I've learned, it always does come down to people power. Yes, judges and politicians write things into law, but ultimately it's people deciding to change social contracts and organizing, whether it's the suffragettes, the civil rights movement, the Stonewall Uprising, anti-apartheid. And so that is my kind of encouragement to people, is to join hands and work together. And I will caveat and say that I think that has never been more difficult in a world that feels very individualized, very atomized, where the narrative is that we are individual, disparate selves, and then we're not part of a community or a collective.
There's quite a bitter irony, isn't there, in the very technologies that do allow this kind of global collaboration are prime examples of the concentration of economic power.
Yeah.
And they are having a profound influence on politics, geopolitics, and personal politics around the world. And you can't help but join in, because that is a means. Those are methods that we can pick up and use to keep connected. And in so doing, we're adding to the concentration of that economic power. It's a really hard one to bust.
Yeah, and it's so hard working on climate in particular, because as you both well know, climate is literally everything, right?
Yeah.
It's the clothes we wear, the food we eat, how we get around the places we live. Yeah. And I think we are all aware of our kind of complicity in the crisis. You live within a system that makes it fundamentally difficult to do the right or responsible thing, unless you have the economic privilege of kind of opting out or buying the most sustainable version, or growing your own food, or buying the designer clothing, that's, ethically made. And, the fossil fuel companies have very deliberately placed that onus of responsibility on individuals to shine a light away from themselves. There was the advent of the carbon, footprint calculator from BP and many different iterations of that concept. But, we're in this weird time. You touched on this feeling of despair. There's so much despair in young people, but then there's also this guilt of being part of the problem.
Yeah.
And then there's this deep disillusionment of, well, even if I go to the polls, I'm probably going to have to choose between a climate change denier and a seasoned procrastinator.
That's a good phrase.
Who's less bad?
Yeah. And so exactly, who's less bad?
Good,
it's always lesser of two evils. It's, where's the inspiration? Where's the hope? Where's the blueprint of what an alternative system can look like? So yeah, we find ourselves in a weird moment where hope feels, far off into the distance.
Yeah, there's an interesting clip of you, Clover, saying maybe we should say no to EVs. And
oh, yeah. Yeah, that one got me a lot of heat from the environmental community as well.
But it's interesting, like stopping and questioning, we should change our cities. We should change the way our cities function and cycle places and walk places rather than using a vehicle in the first place. So,
Well, and I think that's part of the challenge, is that so much of the rhetoric, even within the climate movement, has been predicated on this idea of green growth. And if you look at it, actually, like, the math just does not math when it comes to climate and growth. And I started looking into the projections of EV growth, and with a background of kind of understanding some of the human rights abuses that already exist in supply chains for things like, cobalt. And based on the current growth trajectories, we're going to have to do things like, deep sea mining, right? We're going to have to destroy really important ecosystems to keep up with this kind of pace and this demand, without really questioning and thinking, okay, but how are we actually rethinking mobility? Yes, EVs are absolutely a necessary part of the transition, but is the goal here for everyone to own an electric SUV, to have a giant lawn, to have a 5-bedroom home? It just doesn't actually add up. And so I'm much more interested in what are those solutions that improve our lives, that don't keep us hidden behind screens and walls and cars, but that bring people together, public transport solutions, micro-mobility solutions. So yeah, I think a lot of narratives at the heart of climate have failed to really go to why we're in this situation in the first place. And that, invites a conversation around a history of colonization, but also the commodification of nature and going to the heart of what has become deeply seated inequality.
I totally understand that there are times when it would be smart to take a line that would upset an environmental community that's decided that EVs are a good thing and don't want to hear anything other than that. And there's no doubt that by comparison to other forms of personal transport, it's an advance. And it's actually an advance that, in some sense, the environmental community is making and feeling like it's winning. And that feeling is very powerful. So you don't want to disturb that. And yet, personal transportation, especially in a vehicle that's probably, and certainly the current choices that are available for someone who wants to buy, and include far too many versions of a personal car that are heavy, take up a lot of road space, and are often not even being used. They're sitting in a driveway. My own is doing exactly that right now, when they could be used to store power right now. So it's a nice sunny day. I've got solar PV on my roof. I could also be storing power in my car that I could use in my house. Those technologies exist. That would be an advance. But so would not driving a personal vehicle at all in the city. Of course, we have pretty good public transport here. But each city's got its own opportunity to rethink its structure, organization, its surfaces. I work with an organization, a coalition in the States called the Smart Surfaces Coalition. In fact, John and I and others have been involved with trying to help them promote the ideas here and in other parts of the world. And it's great to change your focus, to look down on a city and say, are these surfaces right for a warming world? Well, actually, no, they're dark. They don't reflect away radiation. They're not green, or not half of them are green. When you do that, then again, you ask yourself, well, how are we going to move people around this space? And in many instances, it would be better if they weren't moving around in a private car. There would be better options, not as a form of punishment, but better ways to live in this space. So those arguments that do need to be made, and if you have to cause a bit of ruction amongst your friends, it's okay. But you have to be able to talk about it in the nuanced way afterwards.
Absolutely. Right? Well, and those are the solutions that I'm most kind of excited about that exist at this confluence of, yes, they're the most sustainable, but critically, they address, the huge mental health problems in our society, which largely stem from this kind of isolation and, time behind screens, that bring people together. And incredibly, there are cities that are already leading the way. I mean, London has been, very ambitious around cycle lanes and pedestrianization of spaces like, Oxford Circus. Paris is doing this. Amsterdam is following Kate Raworth's donut economics model to not just ask how do we green spaces, but how do we bring, sustainable economic prosperity in these types of concepts. But I think to your point, it's so difficult in this current climate to be able to have nuanced conversations, because when I, put out that particular video, I mean, for one, it got picked up by Elon Musk and he turned me into a meme where he branded me a communist for criticizing electric vehicles. But it was so funny how it divided the space where I had environmentalists saying, oh, you're a mouthpiece for the fossil fuel industry. And then I also had, climate trolls or people who don't believe the science coming at me and saying, oh, well, you're a hypocrite. How dare you have a platform on this when, you've clearly flown before or, you're part of the problem. And so it feels like a bit of a minefield because exactly as you said, we need to be able to have nuanced conversations and acknowledge that not one silver bullet solution is going to work for all countries, all communities, all places, right? We need to figure out what works on a case-by-case basis. But even trying to invite that nuance can be considered really controversial.
I mean, just talking about all these problems and all these solutions, it just gets pretty overwhelming, I think. And if you want to take a step into being more activist, I really like the example you give of Malati and her sister because they chose an issue and then that issue was plastics. That's a bit big. Go to plastic bags. And do you think that's a good route into activism to find, rather than saying climate change, find a part of it that you want to address and you want to focus on?
Absolutely, yeah. I feel like one of the most debilitating feelings is that of overwhelm, right? Yeah. And it's also because activism is so often directed through the lens of your personal lifestyle. So it's okay, gosh, I've got to recycle. I need to eat plant-based. I'm not allowed to buy clothes anymore. I can't go on that annual holiday to see my family, whatever it might be. And so I think people just end up feeling really inundated. But my encouragement is always like impact comes from focus, right? So how do you go really deep into one particular issue? Like for me at the start of my journey, my first kind of declaration at the dinner table after I want to be an activist is I no longer eat animals, which was horrifying to my dad, who is both French and a chef. But that became my issue for like over a decade. I went on to do loads of campaigning around deforestation, animal agriculture. I worked at a company called Impossible Foods in the States, which makes, meat from plants, with an incredible founder, Pat O'Brown. And that's where I found my sphere of influence, right? It's like, I don't need to be an expert in the circular economy or fashion or the energy transition. Like, this is the one issue that I'm going to go really deep on and honestly become like obsessive about. And that's my invitation to people is like, what is that one issue within so many bigger issues that ignites a fire in your belly? And then how do you match that up with your unique sphere of influence? What you do for work, what you're gifted at, the people you know, your networks. And I think when we find that focus, we can combat the overwhelm, which is especially prevalent on social media, which is like a constant tap of everything that's going wrong everywhere around the world.
I guess having that focus, but then at the same time, collaborating with others so that you do have that.
I was just going to say that.
Working across systems and no unintended consequences of solutions. And
because system change requires many intervention points.
Yeah.
I mean, you can see how it works conceptually. Focus on an intervention point. Understand if you want a system change, there are many, many others. But it does take others. So the person that has a particular Malati-style focus on an issue and goes right after it and stays with it, actually, I think she's capable of both. But you need some other types to say, okay, I've got that, but I'm going to specialize in the connection between that and something else.
Yeah.
Right? And then you have to build up those coalitions. The problem often politically, and we've covered this in other episodes, including the populism one, is that the counter-arguments in politics can be made quite simply. That we don't want that.
Yeah, very reductive.
We don't want that change you're suggesting.
Yeah.
And some of the more confident politicians that have figured out that there's electoral advantage from taking on the climate change issue and being the one that does not want the transition, they've discovered that they don't need to worry too much about the evidence or the facts. They can just assert. And one of the things that's very difficult, if you do understand the complexity, is how to engage with that. I mean, I'm not asking you for the solution, but how have you engaged with that?
Yeah, it's such a good question because most of my journey has really been about communication and storytelling. And I think that has been my personal sphere of influence. And as you said, kind of joining the dots between things that might feel like disparate issues that are actually connected. And that's why I loved, working with John when I first moved to the UK, because he has such a brilliant capacity to connect things and to see into the future. Like I remember, because we were working together, I was 18, and he was saying, in your lifetime, the insurance industry is going to collapse. Now, let me tell you why. But his ability to kind of look into the future is really powerful and to communicate it in a way that people grasp.
John can talk to a boardroom full of skeptical people and at least get them to settle a little bit of their own prejudices aside for a while and listen.
Yes.
He's so good at that.
Yeah. And I think he has, he's such a depth of experience and knowledge, but he shows up into those spaces with such humility. It's a bit like handing me the microphone as a teenager, without a lot of experience and with very fresh ideas, humbling himself as someone with decades of experience, but saying, I want to hear from your perspective. How are you seeing the world? What are you witnessing? But yeah, in answer to your question, I mean, I think it's so important that we go to where people are. And I think that's something that we've really failed to do as the left, as progressive movements, as, climate. We allowed climate for such a long time to be talked about in really abstract terms, net zero, degrees of heating, polar bears, like things that people don't have a tangible, visceral kind of connection to. And where there weren't clear pathways for how people can engage, and exercise their agency. It's like the world's ending, cool. That's it, period. spent a lot of time trying to understand, well, how do you access different audiences? And I had a front seat to that kind of experience with my dad, who, like, genuinely, we declared war over the dinner table for years. And it was because I had my very particular reasons for, not eating meat. And for me, it was an ethical reason. And he never understood that, right? Like, we could go head to head time and time again, and we just wouldn't make any progress. It wasn't until I started working at Impossible and I was equipped with the facts and the data, and I spoke to him about the issue from that perspective of, okay, well, here's what it means for global, land systems and our forests. And for the first time, I could actually make a little bit of progress, because I wasn't sitting on my high horse of saying, I care for these reasons, you should care for the same ones. I was going, well, what do you care about? And for him, he's very data and fact driven. And so I was able to kind of build that bridge. And so that's been my experience campaigning on different issues. It's really understanding, what do people care about? What motivates them? What are they struggling with? And I think that's a necessary journey as an activist. Looking at Malati and Isabel again, they started out petitioning for plastic bags, but when they first had that conversation with the governor of Bali, they weren't talking about it from an environmental aspect. They were saying, well, how do you think this is going to affect tourism if in 10 years no one wants to come to the island, because it's drowning in plastic? For the tourists, it was, you have a responsibility. You're coming to this island. Do you want to safeguard it for future generations? So very targeted messaging based on the stakeholders they were engaging with. So that's what we need to get much better at. And I think it doesn't always have to lead with climate, right? If we're talking about the fossil fuel industry in this country, climate's going to go over plenty of people's heads, and for good reason. They have more immediate issues that they're up against. Let's talk about the price of energy. Let's talk about lowering people's bills. Let's talk about decentralized energy systems where a handful of shareholders get to decide the price. That's not right. People should be able to generate their own energy and actually get paid back from the grid for having a surplus. So grounding it in what is real, what is visceral, and what connects to people's lived experience.
Yeah.
It's something we've tried to talk about before, but you said so eloquently, kind of.
It's nicely put.
In terms of activism, communication, a lot of activism that we see in the media is Just Stop Oil, for example, their recent campaigns throwing soup on artwork, and it gets a mixed response. Mm-hmm. What do you think about these tactics? I know Just Stop Oil, for example, are now ending their direct action, at least for the time being. Mm-hmm. I would be interested to know what you think about maybe the generational perspectives on different types of activism, different tactics, whether perhaps some are more effective than others, whether some tactics maybe are even harmful to the climate movement. Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
It's a great question. I just gave a talk on this actually because I was really interested about the public's response to movements like Just Stop Oil and XR in the context of nonviolent direct action. Mm-hmm. So the first thing I will say is that nonviolent direct action, throwing paint, which I will add is, food dye and cornstarch. It's nothing permanent. It's not a new tactic. And in fact, if you look at past people-powered movements, they were objectively much more quote unquote radical. You look at the suffragettes, they were actually destroying original artworks. They were going on hunger strike. 1,300 suffragettes were arrested for breaking the law. And those tactics were necessary. They have been necessary as cornerstones of people-powered movements. But it has been that alongside lots of different other theories of change and strategies to move things forward. So if you look at, women's right to the vote in the UK, yes, it was nonviolent direct action. It was also, because you had the suffragettes and then you had the suffragists. And so you had the suffragettes as a more radical kind of spin-out movement. The suffragists were more concerned with hosting the dinner parties, courting the parliamentarians, having those backdoor conversations, doing the work that, folks like John are really effective at, going to quote unquote the other side. You also had this in the context of the two wars, right? And, women suddenly no longer just having a place at home, living domestically as mothers, they suddenly had a real role in the workforce, right? So there were lots of different kind of confluences and different factors that came together. But critically, we must defend our right to protest, our right to use our voices. And I think what's interesting about this particular moment, the way that movements like Just Stop Oil and Exile have been demonized, so much of that rhetoric has been peddled by the Murdoch press and by the billionaire press in this country, because they do pose a direct threat and they provide an easy scapegoat, right? When we should be imprisoning, fossil fuel CEOs, I believe, for their crimes against humanity, why is it that peaceful protesters, people who have not harmed anyone, are going to prison with 4 and 5 year sentences, not even for protesting, but for their role in merely planning to stage protests? There's another spin-out group called Youth Demand, and they're a youth group that are focusing specifically on the genocide in Gaza. And they've been hosting meetings where they come together, really as just spaces for people to talk about this moment and what's happening. They hosted their most recent meeting in a Quaker house, and the police stormed the building. They broke down the door. They arrested these young people, some of whom were teenagers. One was an undercover journalist, locked them up, raided their homes overnight, looked at their phones. Again, for a peaceful meeting in a private premises, which is a spiritual place of meeting. And the Quaker House were absolutely astounded by this absolute breach of, again, our rights as citizens to have active involvement in our politics, to take to the streets. So I think we're at quite a scary moment in terms of our rights to protest, which have always been a cornerstone of our democracy. And we're seeing that much more extremely in America, where activists are literally just getting disappeared overnight. So I think too much conversation goes around disputing Just Stop Oil when we should be focusing on how do we defend the rights of protesters.
Yeah, it's true that the reaction, use the word advisory, against some of the protests, particular protests, blocking roads was a classic one, is extreme, but it also reveals how uncomfortable, particularly an older generation, is about the challenge that's coming at them. For in many respects, something they assumed to be a good thing, namely economic growth, prosperity, security, coming from energy as they understand it. And energy, as they understand it, is fossil fuel-based. So how can that be wrong? At the edges, there'll be some recognition that there are negative consequences. But when the assault comes more directly to them in what they do every day, like drive along a motorway, it really is uncomfortable. But change is uncomfortable for most people. The issue then is how does a society change in a way that stays secure, peaceful, harmonious? And that's really difficult to manage. You can't really manage it, but you have to have strong institutions. And it's a problem if your most important institutions, government, but also the judiciary, also overreact to the challenge. Some of the tactics are not mine, but as you said, I might actually, from what I do, benefit from not being Just Stop Oil. Because in the conversation after the incident or the overreaction, there's space for someone like me to be able to have a conversation about, well, you may not like that form, but the issue is very important and you need to how else would you like to deal with the issue?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's quite natural to feel ambivalent about a particular form of activism that makes you feel really uncomfortable. You're kind of supposed to, right?
Yeah.
But equally, that won't be enough. And it's very good, the example you gave of suffragists. There's still a live debate amongst historians about whether the suffragettes might have delayed the change, because of the reaction against it, when then perhaps the more reformist route was making more progress. I don't know, but it is quite correct, I think, reviewing history and assessing also the moment we're in, that a big societal shift requires all of these elements.
Yeah.
And the loss of millions of young men in a war had an effect. The next war also fundamentally altered women's rights because women were in mainstream work because they had to be.
Yeah.
Right? Otherwise,
Yeah.
things fell apart.
Yeah.
So each of these big cycles of change contain multiple elements that need in some way to be shaped and moved towards an outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the challenge, and part of the story that often doesn't get told is that many of these protesters are climate scientists, right? They're not just, blue-haired, what some might consider hippie, extremist activists dropped out of university. They're scientists who have been trying to sound the alarm for decades and who are just at their wits' end and desperate, right? And it is an expression of desperation. And the thing is, like, if anyone sits down and reads, the latest IPCC report, you look at the actions of protesters and you go, okay, well, that's absolutely proportionate. If anything, it's not extreme enough, right? If we look at what's coming down the line by way of climate breakdown, food system collapse of coral reefs, collapse of weather systems, etc., the challenge is obviously 99% of people are not going to read that IPCC report, and the media has done a really terrible job of sounding the alarm on climate. And so I think a lot of these protesters, they're acting from this place of, well, the media is not going to report on it, so we're going to do what we need to get the headlines. And yet, unfortunately, the story so often becomes about the protesters themselves and how do we scapegoat and demonize them rather than, hey, what they're protesting about is really, really valid, right? And we need to have that conversation. So I think that's why, we need lots of different layers of kind of subversion and inviting people to defect, because yes, you need the people who are protesting, but you also need the person at work who is able to speak out and challenge business as usual and be that one person. And it's really, really uncomfortable, calling out what's not working. And I've often been in that situation as an activist. Like last year, I was in a room of 200 business leaders in Paris, and it was an award ceremony to recognize their good behavior, even though objectively they're some of the biggest polluters on the planet. For whatever reason, they invited me to come along and speak. And what was astonishing is that I had just come with the facts, right? I'm like, I'm just going to communicate the science because most of them have their heads in the sand, right? So I started communicating the science. Here are the data points. And people in the audience started to boo and heckle. And I stopped, startled, tried to locate where these people were, picked up my speech again, and then it happened again and again. And there were more and more voices each time. And I abandoned my script. One of the people in the front row was saying, that's unfair, right? I was communicating the science. They're saying, that's unfair. Pointing the finger at us. This very defensive kind of response. And I was so filled with rage that I just abandoned my script. And I said, you want to talk about unfairness? Let's talk about the fact that millions of people are already paying the price of the inaction of people in rooms like this one. Let's talk about fairness. And then I walked off the stage, burst into tears, found a broom closet to hide in until they'd all left. But what was staggering is that afterwards, I got a flurry of messages from people in the audience who said, thank you so much for speaking out. There was someone there who said, that was like sitting in first class on the Titanic, right? These people in suits holding their glasses of champagne, congratulating themselves for, doing their bit when actually they're part of the problem. But what I was so surprised by was that no one chose to speak up in that moment.
That is really surprising, actually. I am amazed at that. First of all, the behaviour is outrageous, but it's hard. It's very difficult to exaggerate how high the risk is. There's clearly no shortage of evidence of the manifestations of climate change over a period of years now. I know human beings kind of absorb bad news and they sort of move on and they find it. And this is a really hard issue to communicate because it's so dispersed and because, as we said, it's all about everything. But that reaction is an appalling combination of arrogance and ignorance, actually, too. But the follow-up question is, okay, so what can be done about that? What form of activism can really get to that? Now, we've had some conversations, not necessarily arriving anywhere particularly hopeful, but we've had some conversations about finance, about insurance, about law. There's three.
Tools, yeah.
And I tried over many years to occupy the space between those sorts of disciplines and to be effective at communicating. But it's a good challenge when you've had that experience to think, all right, so apart from you should be ashamed of yourselves for that kind of behavior, what is going to make you pay attention and do something with the power that you've got? And I don't know whether it is because of my origins, my professional origins, but I'm increasingly coming around to the feeling that it's law, but it's law that has to be obviously made legitimately through political processes, parliamentary processes that make the rules. So that perhaps gets back to your people power, politics, policy, law, enforcement of law, institutions, in that kind of sequence.
Yeah, I think that's where so many of us have kind of arrived. We've come from very different perspectives and work and careers, but more and more I realize that, purely because of the kind of shareholder model that we have and shareholder capitalism, companies aren't going to move until they're forced to. And either that's going to come through regulation or it's going to come through climate breakdown, making it, prohibitive to keep going as they are. And unfortunately, we can't really wait around for that scenario. And there have been some incredible court cases in, places like Ecuador who have written in the rights of nature, from where, cases have been launched to hold mining companies to account, to say what they're doing is actually unlawful. There's been some great work in Europe as well around the rights of children and future generations, and the work that Wales has done with the Future Generations Commission, saying, well, all decisions now need to be made through this lens of how it's going to affect young people 50, 100 years into the future. And so I'm really hopeful about those mechanisms. Client Earth is easily one of my favorite organizations.
Yeah.
They're so badass. Like, what they do is so, so cool. If I was a lawyer, I would join them in a heartbeat. But, that's what we need to do. We need to write it into the system. I don't honestly think there's any other way. But I'm really fascinated by the kind of psychology and I think the mental gymnastics that so many people in positions of power perform to get away from their responsibility. And it's going to get more and more painful as climate breakdown manifests all around us, as, fascism is on the rise, as democracy breaks down, telling those stories about why the work that you're doing is somehow justified in the context of climate collapse. It's just going to become impossible. But, I think there are those who are brave enough to challenge themselves and to question how they've perhaps been complicit in the system. And, I've met so many business leaders who have defected from those corporations and are now working at incredible NGOs or startups or, on the other side of lobbying, from having lobbied for their corporations to lobbying to actually get positive regulation through. But I think, that's probably the biggest barrier that we're up against right now, is the really pervasive denial, which isn't always as overt as climate change isn't happening, but, climate will be solved through technology that doesn't exist yet, or, businesses will opt to do the right or responsible thing, even as all of the data shows otherwise. That's where I'm focusing most of my attention right now.
I mean, that example you gave, Clover, how did you pick yourself up from that? Is it the community that you have within the activism community? How do you motivate yourself again after something like that happens? Because it must have been really hard.
Yeah, it was really, I called my partner Griff afterward and had continued the cry on the phone to him. And every time I'm just like, I don't know if I can keep doing this. This really sucks, and that's maybe what, on social media, you see me speaking on stages and, getting these very cool opportunities and having a platform. But I don't think we really talk about that side of how deeply uncomfortable activism is a lot of the time, because it calls on you to speak the truth that no one really wants to address, and to walk in the lion's den. And I had it again last month. I was in Brussels. I met a group of corporate lobbyists, and they were trying to argue not all of them, but a number of them were trying to argue why activists are the reason why the world is so divided right now. One point of my origin story, I was talking about, meat companies and how animal agriculture is, disastrous for places like the Amazon and, million-year-old forests being bulldozed to produce Big Macs. And someone jumped in and started defending McDonald's as actually a really good company that's really positive for the world. And I was like, that's such an interesting hill to die on. But we kept having this very heated back and forth. And eventually I just started crying, in the room. And this very posh British man was moderating the session. He's like, oh, okay, well, we'll end the session. I was like, no, it's okay. Tears are fine. I'm all right.
Yeah.
But I was just crying. And I said to the people in this room, I was like, I'm not here because I find this fun, frankly. I'm not enjoying this. I'm not getting paid to be here, unlike all of you in this room. Mm. I do this because I love the earth. I love my community. And I believe that we can do so much better. But as I was saying that, the key kind of instigators of the, kind of attack opened their computers and started typing away because they genuinely couldn't look at me. They couldn't make eye contact with me. And I think that goes to show some of the kind of, mental defenses that people have up, particularly when you approach them from a very human and vulnerable place. So after, those kind of instances, I think it's easy to feel really hollowed out and to question the work, and to feel very empty. But that's where I really draw on my, activist community. And actually the day after Paris, I had another speaking engagement on stage with a bit of a mouthpiece for the fossil fuel industry. And I was chatting to my friend Ingmar. I don't know if you know Ingmar from We Don't Have Time.
Yes, I do, actually. I've done a few things for them, yeah.
So I was chatting to him.
I know Nick more.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Ingmar was super outspoken. I was speaking to him and he was like, well, that's just BS. How dare they, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, yeah, I know. I really don't feel like doing this panel right now. I'm just really running on empty. And he's like, no, you've got it. I'll be sat there in the front row. And the panel started, and this French politician who works on behalf of the fossil fuel industry started defending the fossil fuel industry, right? And saying, the green transition, it's leaving people behind. We need to focus on energy security. We get that through fossil fuels. I was trying to work up the courage to kind of counter what he was saying, but I was so shaken by what had happened the night before. And I locked eyes with Ingmar, and he stood up and from the audience started shouting, that's not true. Why are you lying at this guy? And the French politician was so kind of startled by this that I then had a window and a moment to jump in and say, okay, cool, yeah, let's look at the data. Let's look at the facts. Let's talk about that.
I really like that example because it's, I could have a conversation with someone in that audience who did not want to hear, who had a position to defend, who probably had some arguments that had some value, but not in the whole context of the issue. And so I would want somebody else to step between you and them and say, okay, but you do know that this is a real problem that needs solving. Yeah. And we need to do something more than disagree. Yeah. Right? But you've got to be able to disagree first. Yeah. And then figure out what's next. So well done, Ingmar. But I would argue that that example conveys beautifully how an activist can combine with a reformer or some else. I don't know what the phrase is, right phrase to use, but someone
Reform's
else.
A bad word now.
I know. Yeah, of course it is. Yeah, we've got to watch that. Well, who knows? Maybe that's something we should try and learn how to do, how to take the word reform and own it.
Should we all be climate activists?
Yes. Keep it short and sweet. Yeah, this movement needs everyone, all ages, all backgrounds, all careers. We're not going to solve this with 100 perfect activists. We need millions of imperfect activists.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to Fossil versus Future. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and give us a rating. Follow us on social media and send us your what about questions that you'd like us to discuss.